Good morning. It is so good to see. To be honest, I expected to see some of you at 11, but I'm glad you got up early. I'm worried about the folks in the balcony, though. I know it's comfortable up there. So, Gail, if anybody goes to sleep, you take care of them. All right. If you have your Bible, I want you to turn to Matthew 26. And while you're turning there, I have a question that I want you to think about. And the question is, what do you do when you're confronted with a problem that you don't know how to solve? Now, some of you probably found yourself in that situation maybe over the past week. And what normally happens is most of us by this point in our lives have developed some sort of go-to strategies that we naturally gravitate toward whenever we have a problem that we don't know how to solve. For example, in our culture, some people's, go-to strategy is that they're going to put a post on Facebook. And no matter how personal their problem might be, they're going to put it up there, and then they're going to sit back as all that well-reasoned, carefully thought-out response comes from their various Facebook friends. If you're like me, being a more private person, maybe you have some trusted friends that you occasionally reach out to and you say, hey, help me think through this. Or maybe you're a person who's super private. You like to keep your own counsel. You sit back and you very methodically work through the pros and cons of all the different options. We've all got our go-to strategies that we use. But whatever your strategy might be, there's a mistake that a lot of us tend to make. Albert Einstein, whose birthday we're going to celebrate later this week, pointed out that when it comes to solving problems, almost all of us make the mistake of rushing toward a solution without really identifying the problem. So here's the way he said it. Here's the way he explained his approach. We're going to put this on the screen just so you can follow along. He said, if I had an hour to solve a problem and my life depended on the solution, I would spend 55 minutes determining the proper question to ask. For once I know the proper question, I could solve the problem in less than 5 minutes. Now, whatever you think about that last statement about him being able to solve, whatever the problem might be in less than 5 minutes, I want you to think about the first part of what he said, because it's like the total opposite of what most of us do. We find ourselves confronted by some issue, there's some problem, and we rush through the issue to try to find the solution without pinpointing exactly what the issue is or what the question might be. And that may explain why, at least for me, and probably for most of us in here, we're not a whole lot like Albert Einstein. The similarities aren't too great. What he understood that a lot of us have forgotten is in order to get the right answer to solve the problem, you first have to ask the right question. Now, you have your Bible open to Matthew 26. We're in week 4 of this series that we've called The Week the World Turned. We've been taking a day-by-day look at the last week of Jesus' life on earth. And by the time you get to Wednesday of that final week, everybody involved in this ongoing drama are asking questions about what they've seen and what they've heard and what they've experienced with Jesus. On the previous Sunday, you remember, they had lined the streets as Jesus and his entourage came into the city. Jesus rode on the back of that donkey. On Monday, he went back to the temple. He stormed into the temple. He overturned the tables of the money changers, created a really chaotic scene. On Tuesday, he once again went back to the temple where he spent the better part of the day telling stories and answering questions and teaching the people who had gathered there. So by the time you get to Wednesday, you've already had 3 days of Jesus in the city of Jerusalem. What's happened is his popularity with the people has continued to grow, while the opposition from the religious leaders has continued to intensify. That's where we pick up the story in Matthew 26. As the sun came up on that Wednesday morning, the religious leaders found themselves facing a problem that they didn't know how to solve. If you read between the lines, it's safe to assume that on Wednesday morning, just like he did the previous 2 days, on Monday and Tuesday, Jesus got up early. He and his entourage went back into Jerusalem. He went back to the temple where the crowds had sort of gathered waiting on him. He spent the better part of the day teaching the people, and then as the day came to a close, he left the temple, he left Jerusalem, and he went out to a little village called Bethany, which was located a couple miles outside of Jerusalem. And it's on that Wednesday evening that all four gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, tell us about this really kind of strange incident that took place at a dinner party that Jesus was at that was being hosted by a guy named Simon the leper. So just to set this up for you, what you find in Matthew 26 is a story about a really powerful group of people and two diverse individuals who are all asking different questions about Jesus. And the reason the questions that they asked are so important is because they're a lot like the questions we find ourselves asking today. In fact, as we go through this, it could be that you're asking one of the same questions that they were asking. So what we're going to do is just go through the story. We're going to identify the three questions, and I'm going to give you one big idea as we close today. So if you're tracking with us, here's the first person, the first group of people that you're introduced to, and those are the religious leaders. And the question they were asking is, how can I maintain my lifestyle? Matthew 26, verse 1. When Jesus had finished saying all these things, he said to his disciples, "As you know, the Passover is 2 days away, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." I want to stop right there. This is one of those times when Jesus says something, and somehow, even though everybody's listening, it goes right over their head. Like, they just have no idea what he's talking about. They can't imagine what any of that means, and so they just kind of flies right by them. Then you get to verse 3. Then the chief priest and the elders of the people assembled in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and they schemed to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him. But not during the festival, they said, or there may be a riot among the people. So they've had 3 days of watching Jesus, stacked on top of 3 years of hearing about Jesus, and they've decided, after 3 years of hearing about him and after 3 days of watching him for themselves, that Jesus has to be eliminated, because they've discovered that as Jesus' popularity begins to grow and continues to grow, their popularity declines. So it's like his influence goes up and theirs goes down. And so they've decided that something has to give. And keep in mind that for the religious leaders, the number one thing they're worried about is not what's best, it's not what's right, it's not what's true, it's not what even God wants. Instead, the number one thing on their agenda is, how can they maintain their power, their position, their influence, and their lifestyle. And I don't know if you know this or not. This may surprise some of you. But we're actually right now entering into an election season. Did you know that? Like, I didn't, and I don't know if you knew that or not. And one thing that's going to happen over these next few months is these campaigns are going to use every possible means to contact you. So you're going to get text messages, you're going to get emails, they're going, the robocall thing, they're going to just inundate you with contacts, and they're going to ask you to do two different things. First, they want you to give your money to support their candidate, right? That's number one. And secondly, they're going to ask you to fill out some kind of form, take some kind of survey, so that they know what you're thinking. They call them public opinion polls. And what they do is the consultants will take what you give them, and then they'll help their candidates tailor their message or craft their message so that their message sounds a lot like what you want to hear. It's hard to explain, but in our current political environment, most of the people running for office would much rather reflect public opinion than they would do the hard work of shaping public opinion. So they kind of tell you what you want to hear in hopes that you'll vote for them. And most politicians, not everybody, but most won't do anything to risk upsetting anybody because that might cost them some votes. That's exactly what the religious leaders were doing in this instance. They've looked around, they've taken all the public opinion research. They know that as Jesus' popularity grows, they can't do anything publicly to take him on, so they decide to privately scheme to eliminate him. That's a subtle indication that lets you know that their primary concern is not what's best for the people, it's what's best for them. They want to know, how can we maintain our status? See, they've done the math, and they've looked around, and the truth is, they kind of like where they're at, and they want to stay there. They kind of like the idea of wearing the fancy robes and being invited to all the dinner parties. They like it, like when they walk in the room and everybody stands up and notices them. They kind of like the influence that they've amassed. They like the power that they've amassed, and they want to keep it. And so they know if they take on Jesus publicly, some of that may go away. They also know if they let him remain, that a lot of that's going to go away as he gets more popular than they are. And to add to the challenge, they also know that if they make a wrong move, it won't take much for the Roman Empire, the Romans, to come in, restore order, eliminate Jesus, but also replace them. And they don't want any part of that. The mistake the religious leaders made was that rather than accepting Jesus as the long-awaited Messiah that they had spent centuries waiting on, they instead viewed him as a threat to their lifestyle. You ever done that? You ever viewed Jesus as a threat to your lifestyle? Now keep in mind, these are not like random dudes. These are the religious leaders. These are the guys that don't just go to church like on the weekends. They go to church every day. They don't just like attend the classes. They teach the classes. They had memorized the Old Testament. They knew the words to all the songs. They knew the order to offer all the sacrifices. I mean, these are the guys that knew everything. And yet there was a part of them that knew that if they accepted Jesus for who he really was, that Jesus would make demands on their lives that they weren't ready to meet. There were things that Jesus was going to ask them to give up that they weren't willing to give up. And so the question that they kept asking, it's not what's right, it's not what's best, it's not what does God want. The question is, how can I maintain my lifestyle? Now contrast that with the second person that we're introduced to in this passage, and it's a woman who's asking a much different question, and the question she's asking is, how can I honor Christ? So you get to verse 6, there's this abrupt scene change. So the religious leaders are, under the cover of darkness, they're meeting in Caiaphas' palace, trying to scheme to eliminate Jesus. At the same time all that is happening, there's this private dinner party at the home of Simon the leper out in Bethany, a couple miles outside of Jerusalem. And it says that it's during that dinner party that this woman shows up and she interrupts the proceedings and she does something that nobody in the room understood except for Jesus. Here's the way Matthew tells the story starting in verse 6. While Jesus was in Bethany, in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, which she poured on his head as he was reclining at the table. When the disciples saw this, they were indignant. Why this waste, they asked. This perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money given to the poor. Aware of this, Jesus said to them, why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. When she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare for my burial. Truly I tell you, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. Now, in John's telling of this same story, in John chapter 12, he tells us that the woman who performed this incredible act of worship was actually named Mary. She was the sister to Lazarus, the guy whom Jesus had raised from the dead a few days earlier. So it only makes sense that she would want to do something to honor Jesus for what Jesus had done for her and her family. But in this instance, it's what she chooses to do that gets all the attention. Verse 7 says that she took an alabaster jar filled with very expensive perfume, and she poured it on Jesus' head. So I've got a picture of what this jar would have looked like. Now, that may not look like much to you, but the other gospel writers tell us that the perfume was made of pure nard, which is this spice that grows in India. It's a very heavy, kind of woody, kind of a sweet smell, and it's the kind of smell that would have filled the room. It was also very hard to come by. Matthew tells us that the cost of this was the equivalent of 300 denarii, which is what the average person made during the year back during the first century. So if you put this in 2024 terms, you're talking about this perfume would have cost somewhere between $50,000 and $60,000. So this is not like Brute like you get at Walmart. I mean, this is something that if you were to watch this, you're sitting back and you think somebody comes in and they've got a $50,000 perfume and they're getting ready to pour, and you would think, what in the world is going on? And the disciples see that, and of course they've got these comments that they have to make. And if you listen closely, you can hear their comments, and because you've heard comments like them. Especially if you have spent your life trying to follow Jesus, you've probably heard comments just like she heard, maybe even from people that you love. And usually it goes something like this. What do you mean you're going to drop out of the state school and go to Bible college? Are you nuts? You know how much money that's going to cost you? What do you mean, like, you can't go to the beach this summer because you're going on a mission trip? Like, what is a mission trip? What do you mean you can't buy that because you gave the money to support that other thing? What do you mean you can't go with us this weekend? Because it's your weekend to serve an FCC kids or play on the worship team or be a door greeter or teach. I mean, don't you think like you're taking this church thing a little far? I mean, some of you have heard comments like that. Some of you have lived your life with comments like that. And that's exactly what Mary in this story was facing. The mistake the religious leaders made is that they wanted to be loosely connected to God while maintaining a pretty comfortable lifestyle. So there's no way, like, they would have never wasted that kind of money. They would have never performed anything like that. But for Mary, it was different. Mary's primary concern is not what's easiest for me. Her primary concern was how can I best honor him? And make sure you understand, when that's the question you're asking, when that becomes the lens through which you view everything, there's going to be people around you who don't understand it. Maybe even people in your own circle who look at that and they say things that indicate they just don't get it. In this instance, it's the disciples who should have known better who criticized Mary, but Jesus very quickly corrects them. He lets them know that what she's doing is bigger than they realize. It's important to remember that throughout this last week, everything is building towards Friday. Everything is building towards the moment Jesus will take his last breath as he hangs there on that cross. And so Jesus knows that as he sits here on this Wednesday night, that his crucifixion is now just 36 hours away. Nobody else seems to know it, but he knows it. The next day, on Thursday, he'll go back into the temple. When that's over, he'll celebrate the Passover, what we call the Last Supper, with his disciples. From there, he'll go to a place called the Garden of Gethsemane to pray. While he's there, the Roman soldiers will show up. They'll interrupt his prayer time. They'll arrest him. They'll take him off to stand trial. And the next Friday morning, he will be crucified. And so Jesus knows as he sits there with that perfume running down his head and that overpowering aroma filling that room, he knows that the clock is ticking. And while that's happening, there's another guy who played a pivotal role, and especially in the last 36 hours of Jesus' life, who when you get to verse 14 of Matthew 26, he steps into the forefront of the story. His name is Judas. And the question that Judas was asking is the same question that a lot of us have spent our lives asking. It's the question, what's in it for me? Verse 14 of Matthew 26. Then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priest and he asked, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?" So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. Now, of all the tragic figures that play a role in this Easter drama, Judas is the one that's hardest to figure out. Like in today's world, if you were to call somebody a Judas, that's a huge insult. It's an emotionally charged insult. And it's interesting, as you read through all four Gospels, the Bible never says why he did exactly what he did. That's led to a lot of speculation. Some people say that that he was jealous of the other guys in the group. And it's true. If you go back and look, Judas is the only one of the disciples that was from Judea. The rest are from Galilee. So it's possible that maybe he felt like he didn't fit in with the group, and there was some, relational friction, and he kind of pulled back over time. Other people say that he was overly ambitious, and he didn't feel like he was being respected enough. And it's true. You read through the New Testament, it does seem to indicate that Judas was kind of a really high IQ individual. That's why Jesus put him as the treasurer of the group. And then he had to sit back and he watched as people like Peter, James, and John, climb the ladder, and they reached a position that he didn't get to, and so maybe that set him off. There's also ample evidence that Judas was greedy for money. If you go back and you look at John's telling of the story, you got to keep in mind, John, who knew Judas personally, he adds a comment here that lets us know that it was actually Judas who got the disciples stirred up when Mary performed this act of worship. And then he says it like this in John 12, "But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected, why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages." And then John sort of explains this in a way that only an eyewitness would. He said, "He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And as keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it." So it's possible that all of this is just a money grab, and Judas is just greedy, and he's trying to line his own pockets. But it's also possible that what happened to Judas is what happens to a lot of us. Some people say that over time, Judas grew increasingly disappointed with Jesus, and eventually that disappointment led to him being disillusioned with Jesus. You got to put yourself in his shoes. So 3 years earlier, just like the other guys, Judas left everything behind. He signed up to follow Jesus, and in that moment, he thought he was signing up to follow this military strategist, this political leader who would overthrow the Romans, restore Israel's independence, and sort of set everything right with the world. But now it's been 3 years. 3 years have passed, and the Romans are still in charge. Israel is still enslaved. And as Judas looks around, he doesn't see any army. He doesn't see any stockpile of weapons. He doesn't even see a battle plan to move forward. And so he's increasingly disappointed. And over time, that disappointment has led to discouragement and drifting and finally disillusionment. You ever been there? Like, don't raise your hand. But you ever thought you were signing up for one thing and it turned out to be something else? That's where Judas was. Maybe, just like him, maybe you thought that when you put your trust in Jesus that you were like entering into this agreement whereby God would just automatically start to solve your problems, right? Your personal problems, your financial problems, your health problems, your relational problems. You just thought, hey, I'm going to follow him, and he's going to take care of all that stuff. And now you've been in this a little while, and you're starting to realize that maybe some of your problems aren't going away as easy as you thought they would. Or maybe you got involved in the church and you thought, well, these are church people. This is good people. These are good people. This is going to solve my problems. And what you discovered is that created new problems for you. And you're thinking, man, like, what are we doing here? Like, if he's not going to solve my problems, then why am I here? What are we doing? First, maybe you were disappointed. Then maybe you got a little discouraged. Then maybe just like him, maybe you started drifting. And maybe right now, maybe even as you sit here this morning, you're on the verge of disillusionment. Some of us have been there. But you know what leads to disillusionment? It's when you get obsessed with asking the wrong question. I've got a picture I want to show you. In the business world throughout the 60s, really up and through the 1990s, the guy you see on the screen was one of the major players. His name is Peter Drucker. He's known as the father of modern management. Even today, if you were to take an MBA program somewhere, you'd have to read several of his books. Back in the late 1990s, just a few years before his death, he was being interviewed on a panel at the Harvard Business School, and he was asked the question, what is the first thing you have to do if you want to turn around a business, a school, or any other kind of organization. Now, throughout his career, he'd been called in to consult with thousands of companies, many of whom needed a dramatic turnaround, so he became sort of the expert on that. And as soon as the question was asked, as soon as the interviewer finished the question, you could see everybody in this auditorium sort of lean forward, ready to write down whatever the great Peter Drucker was going to say. He paused for a moment before answering the question to gather his thoughts, and then he said this. He said, "The most important and the most difficult job is never to find the right answer, it's to find the right question." Kind of hear the echo of Albert Einstein in that. He went on to explain how the most serious mistakes that both businesses, schools, organizations, and people make are not because they have the wrong answers, but rather because they ask the wrong questions. He explained it like this. He said, if one asks the right question but gets the wrong answer, in most instances with the proper feedback, corrective actions can be taken. But if one asks the wrong questions and gets the right answer to the wrong question, chances are irreparable damage will be done, and it will take years to discover the wrong question was asked. So think about this story. Here are the religious leaders. What's their question? How can I maintain my lifestyle? That's a question of self-preservation. And then you look at Judas, and what's his question? His question is the question a lot of us ask. What's in it for me? That's a question of self-advancement. But then you compare them to Mary, and what's Mary's question? Her question is, how can I honor Jesus? What can I do to honor him? That's a totally different question. That's a question of self-denial. And it leads you to a different place. Now, we'll go back to something that I intentionally skipped over earlier that you may have picked up on. In verse 13, after responding to this criticism, Jesus made a statement that has proven to be hauntingly accurate. We're going to put it on the screen just so you don't miss it. Here's what Jesus said. Truly I tell you, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. Don't rush past that. Like there's a part of me, every time I read this story, I wonder, here's the disciples, and they're in this little room, and the perfume is overpowering. I'm sure their eyes are watering. Maybe they're choking on the smell, and they have to be thinking, what is Jesus talking about? Like, what is this gospel? Keep in mind, at this point, there's no gospel. There's no story to even tell. There's about 15 people in a little side room, 2 miles outside of Jerusalem. They had no idea what was going to happen next. No idea how all this is going to turn out. And yet, because Jesus knew the rest of the story, he predicted that at some point in the future, he knew that you and I would be here in Monticello, Kentucky, in this sanctuary on Time Change Sunday, and we would be remembering this story. And the reason I said we remember is because if you grew up in church like I did, this is not the first time you've heard this. You're remembering this story rather than hearing this story, because what Jesus said turned out to be true. But there's a couple other stories that also get remembered. See, just like we know the story of Mary and what she did that day, we also remember the story of the religious leaders. And we know the story of Judas. That brings me to really the big idea I wanted to leave with you today, and it's this. The decisions that we make now determine the stories that are told later. The decisions that we make now determine the stories that are told later. So here's the deal. Just like the religious leaders, their story, Mary's story, and the story of Judas, all stories get remembered and retold every time somebody sits down to read the gospel. And the same thing is going to be true for you. At some point in the future, somebody's going to sit down and they're going to tell your story. And it could happen like soon after you're gone and your kids and grandkids are all sitting around a table and somebody says, hey, tell me that story about Grandpa, or tell me about Grandma, and somebody's going to launch into your story. Or maybe it'll happen when a group of your friends gather to do something that you used to do with them, but you're no longer there. And so they go around the circle and they're telling your story. And so here's the question I want you to think about. What kind of story is it going to be? Is it going to be a story of triumph or a story of tragedy? Is it going to end in laughter, or is it going to end in tears? And I think it all depends on what question you spend your life asking. Because here's what I know is true for you, because it's true for all of us. You think about the biggest problems you're facing in your life right now. They've all been created or at least compounded by the question that you spent your life asking. Every single problem has either been created or compounded by the question that you spent your life asking. So here's what I mean by it. Just like the religious leaders, some of us have gone through our life, and the question that we've asked is, how can I maintain my lifestyle? So you've heard all the stories about Jesus, you examined all the evidence about Jesus, and yet there's a part of you that knows that if you submit to the authority of Jesus, it's very likely he's going to ask you to give up some things that you don't want to give up, or to do some things that you don't want to do. And so as you've gone through life, you've tried to be loosely connected to Jesus without submitting to his authority, and it's created all kinds of problems. Or maybe you're like Judas, and the question you've been asking is, what's in it for me? Like, you want the perks of being associated with Jesus, but you don't actually want to follow Jesus with any kind of depth. And so you go through life, and when things are good, you're pretty good, but things are down, and you start looking for the exit. It doesn't feel like he's holding up his end of the deal, and so you're looking for the exit. You're looking for a way to bail, and your whole life is like a roller coaster. It's up and it's down. It's up and it's down. Can I just tell you that no matter what you're facing, there's a better question. And the better question is the one that Mary asked. How can I honor Christ? Like, what if that became the default question you ask? What if that was the question that you asked every morning? What if you said, just like she, I don't care what anybody else thinks, I don't care how it looks to anybody else, I'm going to do everything I can in every situation to honor him. I mean, how would that change your life? Like, what if you went to work every day and that was the question you asked? What can I do to honor Christ? What if when you went home at the end of another long day and you're hanging out with your family, that was the question? What if every time you interacted with one of your neighbors, instead of thinking, what can I do to get out of this situation, you were thinking, how can I honor Christ? And if you ask that question long enough and often enough, it starts to change everything. I want you to stand with me. For some of us, the reason our lives are so messy is because we've spent way too much time asking the wrong questions and not enough time asking the right question. In some cases, we've even gotten the right answers to the wrong question. Instead of getting better, our lives have gotten messier and more problematic. But the good news is you can change the question. You can move from, how can I maintain my lifestyle and what's in it for me, or whatever version of that you've succumbed to. And you can start to ask the question, what can I do to honor him? And as you do that, it'll put you on a different path that will lead to a better place. And it could even be that someday the people you love, as they sit around and they remember your story and they tell the different stories that have made up your lives, that your story inspires their story. But I want you to know, if you want to live a better story, it starts by asking a better question. So if you're here this morning and you're ready to make a decision that would honor him, you want to pray with somebody, David's here, I'm here. We'll be glad to answer any questions. We'll be glad to pray with you. If you're ready to be baptized into Christ, we'd be honored to be a part of that. Whatever you need to do, we want to invite you to come and meet us on this front row.